Now it's time to measure the placement of the labels. Labels should reside between 1/4 and 1/2 inch below each composition, and they should also appear straight and centered. To find their placement, measure 1/4 of an inch below the left and right compositions and make tick marks on both sides. Line up your ruler and draw a line across the board. The top of each label should sit directly on this line. When centering each label, you could either eyeball and visually estimate its placement, marking its lower right corner, or you can measure the center of the composition and the center of the label, marking these with tick marks to help you more accurately align them. At this point, you should still not have glued anything down yet. You always want to measure and mark the placement of everything before you adhere anything to the substrate. The board you are using may also need to be trimmed, and it is helpful to do this before anything has been glued down. The next step is to measure where the top of the second row of composition should be placed. Keep in mind that there should be at least 2 inches between the bottom of a label and the top of a composition in the next row down. Additionally, a label should always be closer to its corresponding composition rather than an unrelated one. For example, here it is difficult to tell which composition the label in the center belongs to. Measure the width of the label and add that measurement to 2 inches. Here, the label is 7/16 of an inch wide, so I am measuring down 2 7/16 inches, starting at the line that marks the placement of the labels. Make tick marks on both sides and draw a line across the board. This marks the placement of the second row of compositions. Now, with the second row, some additional work needs to be done. Because the rectangular compositions are 3 inches on 2 sides, rather than 4 inches on all sides, like the square compositions, you will need to center these compositions within an imaginary 4 by 4 inch format. Measure 1/2 inch from the edge of the border on the left and make 2 tick marks so that the composition can be evenly aligned and placed parallel to the edge. Mark the bottom right corner of the composition and do the same for the vertical rectangle on the other side of the board. The horizontal rectangle in the center should be treated the same way, although 1/2 inch should be measured from the line at the top rather than from the side. As with the others, make tick marks, align, and mark the bottom right corner of the composition. Now you are ready to measure and mark the placement for the labels underneath these compositions. As done before, measure 1/4 inch below the compositions on the left and right, making tick marks on each side. This time, however, instead of drawing a line straight across, only draw beneath the vertical rectangles. You want to make sure that you're leaving space in the center. Place the top of each label directly on the line. Because the bottom edge of the horizontal rectangle is slightly higher than the other two rectangles, you don't want to place the label on the same line. There would be too much negative space above it. Instead, you want to place it 1/4 inch below the composition. Measure, make tick marks, and draw a line across the bottom. You can now align the label with this line. You will want to continue in the same way for the last two rows, making sure that the bottom border has slightly more space than the other borders. Don't forget about the 13th label. This should be placed in the bottom right corner, either centered within the right border, intersecting the right border, or lined up with the side of the right border. Make sure there is an appropriate amount of space around the label. With this board, it is not necessary to trim the bottom border, but you may be working with a sheet of illustration or mat board that is actually larger than 20 by 30 inches. If so, you will definitely need to cut the board. The first thing to know about cutting mat board is that you should never rush through this process. Line up your ruler and firmly pressing down on it, begin to drag your X-Acto knife across the board. The first pass is only meant to score the board. Do not try to actually cut through it in the first several passes. Sometimes cutting through mat board can take more than 10 cuts, so take your time. Your goal is to cut a clean, smooth, straight edge. Spray in a ventilated area or use a spray booth. Before you turn each composition face down to spray it, make sure the surface is clean. Always spray at a distance of at least 1 foot. Overspraying will damage the paper and cause the glue to bleed through. A little goes a long way. You only need a small amount. Wait several seconds after spraying so that the glue is tacky rather than wet, and then use your finger to lift up the paper. With clean fingers, carefully align the composition or label with a corner, and then before letting it fully touch the surface of the board, make sure that all other corners line up as well. Rather than pressing down on the paper with your potentially sticky fingers, place a clean sheet of paper on top of the composition or label and apply pressure with either your hand or a brayer. So as this tedious yet fun-filled process comes to a close, the final product should look something like this. Don't forget to erase all pencil lines with your kneaded eraser.